Welcome, welcome, welcome panelists. Welcome Sam, welcome Elizabeth, welcome to folks at home who are joining us. We are now live. And today's discussion is titled 100% Tariffs on China's EVs. Is this Canada's just transition? I'm Bianca Magenia, I'm with Canada-China Focus, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. We're joined today by Honorable Elizabeth May and Sam Gindin, as well as scholar Gobind Doogie, who's going to be joining us in the latter part of the discussion as a discussant to help us go a little bit deeper. So welcome to all of you. So Canada-China Focus is the host and the organizer of today's event. And the vision of Canada-China Focus is to facilitate constructive public conversations that develop a better understanding of Canada, of China, and of Canada-China relations. And the project seeks to engage both countries in advancing global decolonization, justice, and peace as essential elements of an independent Canadian foreign policy. And we're hosted by the University of Victoria Centre for Global Studies and the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. And the forum is guided by an advisory committee that's composed of community members and members from universities across the country. So Jessica, who's helping us out in the background, who works with CCF, is going to be putting the relevant information in the chats. So yes, thanks to Jessica for being here. Also thanks to John Price, CCF board member, who's helped to organize and bring together this important, timely discussion. For my part, I am in Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, on the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people and the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I just want to thank you all again for joining us. You can let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat. As always, please do keep your comments respectful, no personal or sectarian attacks. So after the introductions, speakers are going to give their remarks, and this is going to be followed by a discussion. And in the time that remains, we're going to take questions from the audience. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. It's much easier for us to find them there than in the chat. So why are we having this discussion? We're having this discussion because late last month, Canada announced a 100% tariff on Chinese-made electrical vehicles, which comes into effect on October 1st. And so much is at stake right now for Canada-China relations, for trade, for the environment, and for peace as well. So I'm going to take just a minute or so to ground the discussion and share some of CCF's media statement on the issue. So we point out that while it's clear that EVs, electric vehicles, are not the solution to the environmental emergency, but in conjunction with massive expansions in public transit, they could be an element, a meaningful element. We know that good jobs are key in a just transition, but the decision surrounding the tariff last month appears more like political posturing than protecting jobs. It's critical to know this decision emerged during a cabinet meeting where Trudeau revealed he discussed EV tariffs with U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. This means cabinet made its decision as part of a calculated geopolitical bid to support the U.S. And so while this announcement has been couched in the language of protecting industry, as one commentator in the Globe and Mail put it, Ottawa's use of unilateral tools to implement a 100% tariff on EVs is a hallmark of a trade war. Rather than providing economic relief, tariffs will likely restrict EV consumption, as many simply cannot afford the 40,000 plus sticker price. Clean Energy Canada's Joanna Kyriazis underscored that good jobs in the EV sector require strong and growing EV demand. And now, following this tariff, the Chinese government has announced an investigation into Canadian canola exports to China worth, in 2023, for instance, $4 billion. So this is really not good news for farmers. The government and some labor organizations have also accused China of unfair competition and dumping cars. But yet we know that 20 years ago, China made the decision to invest heavily in EV production and incentivize consumption with consumer subsidies. So the result is now that EV sales represent 44% of all cars sold in China. China has also invested heavily in public transit with electric trains and EV buses now widespread. So, I mean, this is good news for the world from an environmental perspective. And so while China likely aims to export more cars, EVs still represent a very small fraction of China's production. So it is very unusual to assert that this is dumping. And, yes, China has subsidized its EV industry, but so does Canada. And after all, we are in a climate emergency. So last point really is that regarding ethics, Canada talks a lot about human rights. But like China, we have a long way to go. Canadian mineral companies are notorious for their abuse of Indigenous communities while extracting minerals for EV production, let alone abroad with the mining companies. So it is important to ask why this decision to impose tariffs was taken unilaterally, why Canada didn't enter into negotiations with China. And some of the background to this is that we do see that over the past 5 years, Canada, the US and Canada have been engaged in an anti-China campaign. You just have to look at the front page almost every day in response to China's economic rise. And alongside this, what we have been seeing, and part of why CCF formed, is anti-Asian racism that often targets China or Chinese Canadians, and that has become endemic. So for all appearances, this feels and seems like preparation to go to war with China, which is a terrifying prospect. And we need the opposite. We need to work together. And so it is CCF's hope that progressive groups across sectors will engage meaningfully with these questions, with these issues, and will prioritize sustainable trade, labor practices, as well as justice and peace. And we're so happy to have Sam and Elizabeth here today to begin having this discussion with us. And with those remarks, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Elizabeth May. The Honorable Elizabeth May is co-leader of the Green Party and represents the Vancouver Island riding of Saanich-Gulf Islands on the territory of Saanich Nation. She has worked as a lawyer and government policy advisor and was the executive director of the Sierra Club of Canada for 17 years. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Bianca. And I hate to correct such a lovely introduction, but the honorific honorable only applies to people who've served in cabinet. And I haven't, strangely enough. So there you go. I'm the honorable member for Saanich-Gulf Islands, but not the Honorable Elizabeth May. However, I hope you'll find that it applies given what I try to do, which is tell the truth all the time, which involves correcting a lovely introduction. I do apologize. And I'm honored to be here. I thank everyone involved with this project, from the Canada-China Focus, from UVic, from the work we're all doing. And I want to start from a higher level of abstraction and try to stay there, because the EV tariffs issue is a tip of an iceberg. And I want to start with first principles, which is starting from first principles as a climate activist since I first learned my climate science from when I was an advisor to the Minister of Environment, but not a member of the party of the governing, the government of the day, which was the majority government under former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. That's when I learned my climate science. I learned it from the climate scientists who were advising the minister, because I was advising the minister. I'm very fortunate to have learned my climate science before the myth of doubt was invented by transnational fossil fuel companies. And I want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, the trade union movement in this country, because Canada's early lead, which we have now squandered, but our early lead on climate, being the first industrialized country to sign and ratify the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, was entirely due to an alliance that did not exist in the US. I mean, it took a while for them to come around to it. But from the very beginning, the Canadian Autoworkers, Unifor, Canadian Labour Congress stood side by side with environmental groups and saying, we want to move to climate action. We're going to have to do it, and we need a just transition. Where we are right now is with a government that has promised a just transition, impaneled under former Environment Minister Catherine McKenna, And under the leadership of co-chair Hassan Youssef, who's now a senator, but used to be head of CAW, impaneled a group to look at what transition looked like for coal sector workers. Sent a group of extraordinary Canadians. It was co-chaired by Lois Corbett from the Conservation Council of New Brunswick and Hassan Youssef, and they told the minister, we're going to go into every coal sector community where people make their living mining coal and talk to them about what a just transition looks like. And the political advice was, oh, don't do that. You'll be skinned alive. Workers and communities rolled up their sleeves and believed something that turned out to be a lie, that this transitional strategy that they were developing would be implemented. It never was. You can find it on government websites. It had the principles for just transition. We managed to work the words just transition, again through leadership of the trade union movement in Canada that played a big role in negotiating the Paris Agreement in 2015, into the very language of the Paris Accord. Just transition is in there. It is not, as has recently been claimed, starting with the Alberta government and then parroted by various Liberal ministers, divisive language. You either have a just transition or you have quite unjust disruption. We don't get the status quo. It's not a choice. We can pretend, and Pierre Poilievre can pretend that it's something we can do, but it's not. So we go back to the highest state levels of abstraction that involve principles. On principle, Canada must play its role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We've gone in the opposite direction. I am deeply grateful to Unifor as an example, as a union that showed up at the National Energy Board on the Kinder Morgan pipeline review with evidence that building the Kinder Morgan pipeline would cost Canadian jobs, cost Unifor jobs by diverting raw bitumen overseas without refining it and using it in Canada. This is a complicated story, and it does not help to have political leadership that decides a winning policy shift is led by anything that rhymes. Okay, you know who I'm talking about. What we're also talking about here is the role of trade über alles in a time of climate crisis. So I put to you that the last successful and maybe most successful treaty of all time on a global environmental crisis was the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer. And it worked because we were allowed to have penalties for violators. 1987, the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer said if any country in this protocol violates its rules and goes back to producing chlorofluorocarbons, every other nation in this, they're parties to this treaty, can bring trade sanctions against them. 1987. By 1997, when Canada went to Kyoto to negotiate, our Minister of Environment said, if trade sanctions are a tool of enforcement, Canada won't sign. What happened in that 10-year interim, 87 to 97? The creation of the World Trade Organization. It didn't make a single ruling, but again, transnational corporate rule and the whole neoliberal project was on the ascendancy. And so trade rules became a tool against climate action. So in that context, let's revisit what's going on here. I'm less troubled by protecting our automobile sector, which we should protect because it's good union jobs. We have an auto pact. We have to protect those jobs, and it's part of a just transition, than I am by exorbitant tariffs that Canada applies against cheap Chinese solar panels. We don't have much of a solar panel industry in Canada, so we're not protectionist. But still, we make the cost of democratized, local, cheap, less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour solar more expensive for Canadians because of these retaliatory tariffs against China. Why? Putting climate action further out of reach. The disruption that we need to have is to get off fossil fuels. Two things, we realized this back in 92. I'll never forget when someone said, a Canadian said, the two things we need to do as Canadians is stop burning coal for electricity and get rid of the internal combustion engine. If we'd done that, our glaciers wouldn't be in retreat, our forests wouldn't be on fire, 619 Canadians wouldn't have died, 619 British Columbians would not have died in the summer of 2021 if we'd taken action that we knew we could take in 92. So, tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, I don't support. I do support union jobs in building Canadian cars. I do support the transition that we make towards electric vehicles in Canada. So rather than apply tariffs against Chinese vehicles at the levels that we're doing, and I really think we could apply some tariffs, but take them off solar panels altogether, but increase the subsidies if Canadians want to buy a Canadian-made car that's an electric vehicle. Meanwhile, let disruption occur. But governments have their foot on the fire hose of disruption because governments, whether they admit it or not, in Canada, provincially and federally, are in the business of defending transnational fossil fuel companies and their profits, no matter what happens to our kids and grandkids. With that, I am very grateful again to the trade union movement, and I want to make it clear that we have to protect good jobs in Canada. And if we don't have just transition as a real thing, which we don't have now, we'll get unjust disruption and we will lose good, well-paying union jobs. I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone over. Thank you, Bianca.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. No, you have not gone over. Not at all. Not at all. In fact, your remarks were very, very brief, but very succinct. And I just want to underscore your clarity. And just the need for us to understand that any trade policy that we adopt has to be carefully weighed against this broader goal of climate action and the imperative to get off of fossil fuels, a point I'm sure resonates deeply with our audience. And also thank you for those really relevant historical moments as well. And I'm looking very forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A period. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Sam Gindin. Sam is co-author with the late Leo Panitch of The Making of Global Capitalism by Verso books and the former research director of the Canadian Autoworkers from 1974 to 2000. He currently works with the Socialist Project in Toronto. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks a lot. I just want to say, first of all, how much I appreciate you putting this forward. There's really historic and very dramatic questions being posed here, and they're not getting a serious discussion in the country. So I think it's great that you're doing this. When I say that these are historic questions, let me say two or three things about that and then kind of get into the issue. One is that the restructuring in the auto industry that we're talking about in terms of moving to EVs is probably the most significant restructuring in the industry since the wartime, when the industry was actually converted to military use. The second historic thing is that China probably represents the most significant challenge, economic challenge, to the American empire. Also, since the empire really emerged in at the end of the war. The third historic thing is what Elizabeth talked so much about, and that is in the context of these other two issues, the geopolitical issue and the restructuring issue, the environment is kind of being marginalized. I mean, people kind of add whatever they're saying. Of course, we care about the environment, but the reality is that these two issues are marginalizing the environment, and that's a thing we really have to struggle with. So what I'm going to try to get at, I'm going to say some things about the economics of what's going on, but I want to get to is how should labor and progressives respond to all of this? And in doing that, I'm also going to be challenging labor itself. So the first thing I'd want to emphasize is how falsely this whole thing is being framed. As you mentioned in your introduction, the notion of saying we have to do this because China is subsidizing its vehicles is absurd. I mean, Canada just subsidized the auto industry by $40 billion. The US subsidies are enormous. This isn't about subsidies. That's hypocrisy. The second kind of argument that comes in is we have to force, Trump is using this, we have to force China to produce those electric vehicles here. And if we put a high tariff on, like 100%, they'll come here. So on the one hand, there's a valid concern, this question of why can't companies who make profits in a particular region actually invest in that region? It's a principle the auto workers held on to for a long time. They lost it to the free trade agreements. So the principle is interesting. And Volkswagen was just saying how much they're investing in China because they think that in order to get access to the Chinese market, it's actually fair to be producing in China for the Chinese market. The trouble with the argument, one of the troubles with the argument is why isolate China on this question? This is a general issue. Why don't we say to all corporations in a democratic society that if you're going to make profits here, you're going to have to be responsible on environmental questions and on responsibilities to workers and their communities. Isolating China gets you into what is a geopolitical argument, not an economic one, and I'll return to that. It's interesting that both of these things, the emphasis on subsidies and the emphasis on telling corporations what to do, challenge free trade. And they challenge free trade in a way that's unilateral and therefore invites retaliation, as Elizabeth said. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of this contradiction of selling free trade all the time, and yet deciding that there are moments when you're just going to ignore it because you've got the power to do that, which the US has. And in Canada's case, basically just following the US as it has done all too often. Both of those kinds of arguments about free trade and forcing the Japanese to come here miss the main points of what's going on. And there's 2 points I really want to emphasize. One is the most significant thing that we're seeing is that the North American industry, and this is true to a large extent of Europe as well, and this includes Canada, has completely failed in starting this transition to electric vehicles. Everybody knew that this was going to happen. China actually went ahead and did it. It went from almost nowhere, far behind everybody else technologically, and now is the leader. You know, in the late 50s, the United States probably had 2/3 of the auto vehicle production in the world. Today, if you look at electric vehicle production, it's the Chinese. So the first thing we have to recognize is there's something wrong with how we have dealt with this question of transition. Subsidies don't work. Subsidies can be part of something, but they have to be part of a larger plan. And that's part of the lesson from China. There's been this failure. Now, when you think about that failure, it gets into another issue. And the second issue is that if we failed so badly in the transition to electric vehicles, which aren't a solution to the environmental crisis, but they're a useful thing, as you said, why do we expect that if we couldn't even do it on the more limited scale and scope of electric vehicles, why do we think that the same kind of system, the same kind of logic, the same kinds of pressures will fix the environment? And I think that's, probably the most important question we really need to address. Yeah, on the EVs, China is producing 2/3 of EV batteries. It's about 10 times the United States. In terms of the market, China has structured itself so that 2/3 of global electric sales are in China. Again, almost 6 times that of the United States. In terms of solar panels that Elizabeth was raising, China now is actually doing something about these things. It's trying to get around its own role in creating the environmental crisis and start moving towards solar and wind power. And on solar power, it's producing about over 60% of the kilowatts, 7 times the United States. On wind power, it's also about 63%, about 12 times the United States. So this is the critical question. If the failure of the EV transition is so obvious, what does this mean? This failure is manifold times when you start talking about the environment as a whole. And I think that the very difficult question we have to address with is fragmented corporations who are competing with each other to make profits are not going to solve the environmental crisis. This is not going to happen. You can't do this by tinkering. You have to realize and appreciate the scale of it, and that means dealing with alternatives. Now, when we talk about the environment, the reality of the environment is that if we're really going to deal with it honestly, in all the dimensions it demands, we're going to have to change everything about how we work, live, travel, play, everything. And in order to do that, we actually need the capacities to do that, which means we need manufacturing capacities. We can't let them go. We need to construct things. We need to change homes. We need to change every kind of engine, every motor, etc. So if that's the case, that we have, if it's at that level at that scale level, we have to change the nature of consumption. We have to change inequalities because we can't get at this if we accept the kind of inequalities where a small portion of the population has such a large footprint because of inequalities and luxury consumption. So we have to combine this need for some kind of a plan to do this with the question of restructuring. And the issue isn't how do we give the corporations more subsidies so they'll do what we want them to do when that's not their prime interest. We have to think of this in terms of we want the capacities. It's not about begging General Motors to stay here. It's about saying, if you leave, we cannot afford to close any facility because we need them for all these things. We need them to make solar panels. We need them to make wind, to deal with the wind panels, with the wind energy. And we need them for all the things we're going to need in terms of solving the crisis. So we need a plan. And if you want to plan things, you have to control what you're planning. You can't let corporations plan it. So I think that is a critical part of thinking about where we go. What is the general direction? And when I say planning, I mean this at both a national, sub-regional, and local level. We need some kind of national conversion agency. We need an ability to fight everywhere where there are closures going on when we could use those facilities for something, for social needs, especially the environment. We should have tech hubs in every community where we have hundreds of engineers figuring out how they take the facilities that exist and convert them into what we need. Okay. Now, if you really think about this seriously, this question of jobs ends up to be a question of transition and restructuring, not the loss of jobs. We don't have enough labor to provide our basic needs and to change everything about the environment. This is an amazing task. And so the real question is, if you did this right, you'd have a shortage of labor. So let me conclude with 3 or 4 points. One is that we have this immediate problem of defending workers, this immediate issue of workers being nervous about this and being pressured by warning them about competition to support these kinds of tariffs. Again, I think that we should put this not in the framework of blocking things from China, which will end to retaliation, but actually of thinking about all corporations that want to make profits in this country, whether they're from China or the United States, whatever, will have to make a commitment to this country and meet labor standards and environmental standards. And that's something that we urge every country. It isn't just a selfish thing for Canada. Mexico should fight for that. American workers should fight for that. I think that's absolutely critical. The second thing to realize and to be honest about is that the auto industry isn't going to be the job deliverer of the past. We just have to recognize this if we're going to move beyond it. The auto industry is now a replacement market. Most people have their cars, they replace them from time to time. EVs use about 30% less labor, so there's going to be some loss anyways. And then technology, when the market isn't growing, is of course going to affect jobs. And even if China came here, as we saw with the Japanese, they're not going to come in here and say, well, wow, you're closing this plant in Oshawa, we'll take it over and convert it. They're going to build a plant where they want, which might be in a non-union state or whatever. That's what happened with the Japanese. So it isn't as if this will guarantee us job security, it'll just mean more competition. What we have to get unions and workers to think about is, yes, they need these transitional and temporary protections of some kind, but they have to start thinking about a large plan and playing the leadership role because otherwise nobody else will do it. And those are radical ideas. And I guess the main point I'd want to make is that the radical is now practical. staying in the middle of the road is over. We learned this from neoliberalism. Options have become polarized. The right has seized it. Corporations have seized it, and workers have kind of dawdled along, waiting for something to change, cycle to change, and it doesn't happen that way. Unless we're mobilizing and mobilizing in a radical way, we cannot deal with these big problems. That's the whole point about these problems. They're so big. And I emphasize that both about this kind of restructuring and especially the costs of the environment. And if we want to go through this period with any degree of security, equality, not resorting to racism and blaming people in a way that isn't actually helpful, we have to think in radical ways. And the other dimension of this is, although these problems are international, they start at home. You can't start by dreaming about the kind of agreements we can envision, which is helpful because it gives us a standard and exposes things, but we have to start mobilizing at home. We have to win these battles at home around the environment and what democratic control can really mean. But the final barrier I really want to emphasize, and this gets to the geopolitical stuff that you raised, is that the Cold War that is emerging is a barrier. Because the ultimate argument that the Americans have really been using, and Canada just kind of tagging along, is this notion of this is a matter of national security. Whatever that means. I don't know if they mean that if we can't make our own trucks, we won't be able to send them to third world countries to engage in war, or what they mean by national security. But this is the main argument. And we have to get away from this argument that is almost assumed in commonly in the media, that China is the villain here. Now, you don't have to like a lot of things about China. You can criticize them. There are democratic issues. There are issues in terms of how workers are treated. But China isn't a threat. The United States has 400 bases around China, around the China Sea. China has 2 bases, which are on its own borders. It's actually about the same number of bases outside their country as Canada has. They have no bases on this continent. China's main objective is trying to increase the standard of living of their population. This is what legitimates this regime. Its ability to deliver, and that's its main concern, and that's why it entered into globalization, because it thought this would be an easier road to development. But that's China's goal. What's happening is that the United States, out of paranoia, out of arrogance, out of just a sense that they have a right to rule the world, are threatening China. Then, of course, China responds. And instead of getting the kind of cooperation which we so desperately need, all of us, that Elizabeth talked about, we end up competing over military, AI, etc. So attacking China is actually a diversion from everything we really need to do. And that's a problem we have to address. And in terms of our relationship to China, I guess my main argument would be whatever we think is wrong in China, those are things that are going to have to be changed in China. We're not going to change them from the outside, and we shouldn't threaten them militarily about changing them. We can show solidarity when things are happening, and that obviously makes sense, but we have to respect the right of the Chinese to solve their own problems and get out of this Cold War mentality, which is so dangerous and destructive, even if we don't get into a war, because of the diversion that it is. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam, for bringing those geopolitical stakes into such sharp focus for us, for our audience, and for making the contradictions so clear as well in Canada's policies. It's just, it's really good to hear you name the time that we're in, and the failures of our transition. It feels really clear-headed, right? To be talking about the demands that a great transition actually requires, right? And the need to face this head on with a plan, a big coordinated plan that's not being directed by corporations that will mean things that won't look the same. So thank you for highlighting what a critical time in history there is. And one of the things I took away when listening to you is that there is no national security on a dead planet. So you can find out more about Sam's work at socialistproject.ca. So that concludes our panelist statements. Wonderful to hear from you, Elizabeth and Sam. It really feels like finally there are some adults in the room when it comes to this conversation around tariffs and China. We're now going to bring an additional person into the conversation. I want to welcome Gobind Doogie. Gobind, welcome to the discussion. Gobind is a discussant who will be helping us to go a little bit deeper into our conversation. Gobind is studying law at York University and completed an MA in political economy with a specialization in work and labor. His current research explores the relationship between labor and environmental movements in Canada, with particular attention to the auto industry. So, Gobind, welcome. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about your research into the relationships between the auto industry and the climate movement as they relate to this moment in history and this 100% tariff. And also would love to hear any reflections and questions that you may have after having heard from Sam and Elizabeth. Welcome, Dugan. Gobind.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Also, thank you, Elizabeth and Sam, for your comments. It was quite insightful, and I'm glad I got a chance to hear them. So I guess regarding my research, so yeah, for my MA at Carleton, I had to, do a research project. And so what I wanted to look at was the challenges that the climate crisis specifically poses to auto workers and what their response has been like so far. So to do that, I looked at, for the union that represents them both in the auto assembly and the auto parts sectors in Canada. So I'll briefly dive into that before maybe posing some questions. So as both previous speakers mentioned, the corporations, they largely just do what's deemed profitable to them or what they think is profitable, which presents a major roadblock if we just leave it up to them to, undertake this transition. So one example of that is Ford. A few years ago, they announced in the Oakville plant they were going to start producing EVs. However, this year that was canceled, and now they've announced they're going to just continue producing Super Duty pickup trucks, which are also just extra production, because they already produce the same pickup trucks in the US. So that presents, a new challenge, obviously, for the members of Unifor that were meant to work there, who now are, instead of producing a new electric vehicle, are going to be producing pickup trucks, which are some of the worst contributors to the climate problem. So just some other challenges that the EV transition poses are that, I think as Sam mentioned, there's a lot less parts needed, which means there's less jobs related to those parts, as well as potentially less assembly jobs to produce, the parts needed, as well as new investments into facilities. These just might not be unionized jobs. So for example, a lot of the new plants that are opening there's no guarantee that they will be unionized. So that presents a really big challenge for both members of, in the union currently that have their jobs that are currently threatened, as well as people that might work there in the future. And this could also lead to, further reduction in union density, which can harm union members as well as reduce their ability to bargain. Furthermore, like corporations are likely to pass on any costs they have to transition to EVs to their workers, to the members of the union, if they, in name of competitive pressures. So in terms of the response from Unifor, largely what I've seen is that they've advocated for government subsidies of EVs to incentivize corporations to produce them here. But as Sam mentioned, there's a lot of problems with that, as well as the example that I was talking about with Ford. They're quickly easy to back out of those commitments to produce EVs, and so it limits our ability to meaningfully transition. As well as a problem that Unifor faces, which I think both speakers mentioned, is a lot of the changes that we had in the late 80s and 90s that gave capital and free trade a lot more power, is that it limits the ability of Unifor to take maybe a stronger stance and advocate for different priorities instead of more radical options that now, as I mentioned, are more needed and should not be considered as radical. Is because these corporations have a lot more power to move production elsewhere, which limits the ability of Unifor to just bargain at that table. So their priority largely in this advocacy for EVs, though, has been to gain jobs and attempt to protect existing ones, but that's almost like a failing battle to a certain extent of how many jobs can you actually protect. As well as what this does is it kind of narrows the scope of what both membership think and also what other people see as possible when you see a union advocating for, okay, we need to give these large subsidies to corporations, and that's kind of the main thing we should be doing, as well as, their very outspoken support as well of this 100% tariff. So instead is that them acting to protect, the interest of Ford, who's now making vehicles here, but is not producing EVs that can, kind of compete in the market with the low-cost Chinese EVs? Or is it Unifor caring for, it doesn't seem like it's Unifor caring for the environment. So what challenges, again, these things as they continue to unfold will change and challenge Unifor and what they can do for auto workers. So the question is, as Sam posed it, is how will they take on this leadership role to present more meaningful options that are not just outright support for, subsidies to corporations because of their obvious limitations. So that's the extent of my research so far. So would now be a good time to move
so
to some
much,
questions.
Govind. Yeah, no, it was really wonderful to hear your thoughtful focus on labor. Yeah, and emphasizing just the leadership challenge as well that we have for labor, and also the voices of workers, which I think is so important. I'd love to hear from you regarding your thoughts and questions for the panelists and the discussion we've just been listening to.
Yeah, so thanks again, Elizabeth and Sam, your very insightful comments. I think one of the questions that immediately sprung to mind when Sam, you were talking about these tariffs in terms of, there needs to be bigger concerns that we have outside of just what is China doing with their production. But what you mentioned was that these tariffs, they might be an attempt to just incentivize China to produce cars here, an attempt to get more jobs. Do you think, or here or elsewhere, do you think that has any chance of being somewhat successful, or do you think they'll find some other way to respond to that?
When you say, sorry, when you mean the auto workers will find another way, or China will find another way?
China. So in response to these
Okay.
tariffs, do you think
Yeah.
cars will be produced elsewhere, or?
Yeah. Okay. Do you want, should I go ahead, or did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Nope, that was my
Yeah,
question.
no, I definitely, I'm quite anxious to respond to what you're saying, which I think was, you raised a lot of things. Let me just say something about the unions first, if that's okay, because I think this is a major part of how we think of the unions. I mean, we obviously need unions because of the potential progressive role that they can play, and Elizabeth really highlighted that. The difficulty is that neoliberalism has made unions very defensive. That's one problem. And in terms of becoming so defensive, they end up thinking primarily about their own interests, and that actually weakens them dramatically. They can't play a leadership role unless they are really playing a leadership role. They can't just have good statements that say we like the environment, and then as soon as something touches them at home, say, but this is an exception, and we have to take care of ourselves. That won't work. They can't take on the corporations by running to support them with subsidies and trying to get an alliance with them, when the whole history of the last few decades has been you can't trust them. It's not an abstract question. It's not an ideological question. General Motors had about 450,000 UAW members when I came to the union, and every round of negotiations they made concessions in order to get job security. And today they've lost pretty much 90% of those members. There's an experience here that we have to say it doesn't work. And thinking that, who we need as allies is the people that Elizabeth was talking about. We need other workers, we need the community, and thinking that we're going to make an alliance with Ford and that's going to save us. I mean, all the evidence is there. You just have to look at it. So workers are in this dilemma. And I think part of this dilemma is that unions can be very inward-looking structures. And in good times, they defend their members and they feel like, well, we're pretty tough. We don't need anybody. And then you find out that you don't have much strength if you're alone. You're going to be isolated. And for the trade union movement, the real questions are class. The questions are, how do you build the working class? And I mean that broadly. I don't just mean other union members. I mean, the unemployed, the precarious workers, people in the community, housewives, all the people who aren't capitalists. They have to build that. And if they can't build that, they're not going to have any power. The problem is always thinking that you're in a jam and you have to quickly, try to become more friendly with the corporations and hope they leave, help you out. That's death. And I guess unions have to recognize that. That's one thing. And then in terms of leadership, they really have to recognize that they're going to have to stick their neck out to build these larger alliances. It isn't good enough to have nice statements, and I think that's really crucial. And so when I raise that, what I'm trying to get at in terms of the environment is, yes, you're a democratic organization, you have to represent your members, you're worried about what's going to happen over the next year or two. And so, you struggle with that. Maybe that requires some temporary protectionism, but you have to learn that you cannot win this way. We have to get out there and talk about the bigger picture beyond ourselves and the longer term, and stick our neck out and do these things, and use our organizations to organize and mobilize. And even if the workers disagree with you, the whole point is to use this organization to genuinely pass on information, pass on analysis, have them talk amongst each other, so you can change them and win them over. So I think those are the critical things we have to think about. In terms of your big question about, well, what if they do all of these things against China? What's going to happen? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is China doesn't actually, at one level, it doesn't care that much immediately, because China can actually say, okay, we'll become the ones that make cars for the world. We're making almost all, we're making 2/3 of the vehicles right now. We'll start making the electric vehicles for the global south, and we'll take over that market first. So at first, I think China's actually got room to respond. China will, of course, retaliate, and that will get, people starting to think about what they're doing in order to save the auto industry and how important the auto industry is. Maybe it isn't a bad idea to actually say, if China, the thing that China has is it's always going to be able to undercut us. And it's not because of low wages. It's because of the volume they have. The volume is the absolute key to all of this. So, it might make sense to say, okay, auto's not going to be the big thing it was in the past. We want to save it because we don't have a transition in place. But in the longer term, maybe the jobs have to come from someplace else. And that's where the environment comes in, and you tie these two things together. And you have a plan, because workers will not believe you if you say, we'll offer you a just transition. They have no reason to trust anybody who says that. They have to see that there's actually a plan, and there's a political plan to organize to make it happen, and that they can experiment with things. And if you experiment in some places, and this question of plants closing is in every community or private sector. Things being privatized, that you could think about how would we use those skills and assets. So we have to pick up on these bigger questions, or nothing will happen. I mean, it'll just get worse. I'd emphasize actually that it's not that nothing will happen, it's that things will get worse. That's actually the option. Either get radicalized and try to do these things, or they will get worse. So I don't know where this will come out. It may, and the other concern Canada should have especially is, if your only alternative is to say we're going to give you subsidies, the Americans can always give you more. If the only alternative is that you're going to threaten them, the Americans can always threaten them with more. So you're already in a bind that you can't kind of play that game. You have to take a chance and do something that is more independent and is based on your own kind of planning and thinking on what you could do. It is possible that with the new administration in the States, they will begin to see that this is no win, and they would, talk to, for example, GM and Ford are going to want batteries from China. They're going to be desperate for them. They may just decide that, look, we're going to make a deal with China that does have China coming in, selling us key parts, and we need it. And they will try to save face by saying that they push China to do something. And it's also possible, if you wait 10 years down the road, these companies that want to stay in business will say, we'll actually make the changes because of the threat of China. I don't know. I'd be a little skeptical in expecting it. The record isn't very good, like on the EVs, how long they waited. But, maybe some of this can be sorted out in the long term. But the main thing that we can do is organize, mobilize, educate, pull these things together, fight against this new Cold War, which is just a diversion from everything, plus it's so dangerous. That's what we can do.
Thank you, Sam. Elizabeth, I'd love to hear from you, either on this subject or your reflections on either Sam's statements or
Well, Sam's right on. If we don't use radicalize a whole lot more, We're dead in the water in a status quo world with transnational corporate rule and the rise of fascism. We have we have to organize in solidarity movements that recognize if we don't have a strong trade union movement, it isn't just about, and I appreciate Sam's critique on the labor movement. I'll give a critique on the environmental movement, but it's not self-interested just for now and just in the moment. If we don't see that we're in a polycrisis world, if we don't see that we have about the same runway to avoid runaway, unstoppable global warming that wipes us out, we're about the same amount of time to save healthy democracies against the rise of bully boy fascists all around the world. And one of the bulwarks of democracy is a strong trade union movement. So solidarity alliances have to include a guaranteed livable income. They have to include social justice. They have to include not accepting for 1 minute that these are incremental changes, tweaking the margins of the status quo, and doing it sequentially, because we're cooked if we try to do this sequentially. We have to recognize that the thing that stopped the rise of fascism, I mean, in contrasting, going back to the 1930s, Germany, we know what happened with a bunch of unemployed, disenfranchised young German men who wondered who they could blame, the other. And we had in the United States, a long time ago, FDR saying, we're going to have a new deal, and we're going to put people to work, and we're going to support trade unions, and we're going to do what needs to be done. And that's what kept a democracy going versus fascism. It's a historical lesson, but it's no less true today than then. I look at this and say, look, China, as Sam said, China's been a disruptor. China has made a sea change for electricity by bringing down the cost of solar so fast that you can now produce electricity fast. You can roll out these solar panels so cheaply that Okotoks, Alberta's latest project is 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Take it to the other end of electrify everything, and someone in the chat posted Saul Griffith's book, which is very good, Electrify Everything. But where's your electricity coming from? You better decentralize and uncouple, well, disempower the monopolistic province by province utilities with no competition that charge whatever they want, because they both they're the power producers, usually through large mega projects, which they distribute along inefficient long wires, and then they charge whatever they want because there's no competition. We need to democratize electricity. We need to decentralize electricity. We need an army of electricians and carpenters and plumbers to install all we need to have heat pumps and solar panels on roofs and local windmills that bring down the cost of electricity so people can plug their car into their house and then plug their car into where they go to work in the day so they can have backup power in case the grid goes down, use the grid as a battery. None of this is going to happen with the way that currently in Canada, every single province has a utility that runs for profit based on being the producer of power and the distributor of power, and anyone who thinks that nuclear, for example, is anything other than a scam to keep the money in the hands of SNC-Lavalin's newly renamed AtkinsRéalis, which runs every nuclear project that's being promoted across Canada. We really need solidarity movements here. And we need to recognize that if we don't make social justice an equal goal with climate action, and we think we can take these things apart, and we think for one goddamn moment we can believe the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers Pathways Alliance and think that net zero by 2050 is anything but fraud, we're cooking our grandchildren. So I get angry about this, but we need to recognize common cause and class struggle. These are connected goals. They're not separate, and they're not siloed, and they're certainly not sequential.
Wow, so clear. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Sam? Sam, you're muted.
Sorry, I just want to reinforce what Elizabeth said because it's just so important. There's a polycrisis. It's big. And the solution to it has to be just as integrated. It can't be one piece of it, the one piece that we're interested in. You know, dealing with the environment has to also deal with private property rights in terms of big capital. It has to deal with equality. It does really have to deal with justice for all. It's not just about union workers. And it does mean changing the organizations we have. so they can take on this battle. And this is a big challenge.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. So I'd love to know if there are any other reflections that our panelists or discussants have before we move into our Q&A with the audience. Okay, so we do have a few questions from the audience. The first one that we have is from John, who wants to know, the need for radical direction seems clear, but we're also in an era where radicalism has been demonized and those who advocate for radicalism are considered terrorists. How can we carve out and build the space in the public sphere? So I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth.
Oh gosh, there's so many right-wing radicals. How come they're not, I don't know. I think the enemy of progress, and again, I said I was going to turn the lens back on the environmental movement, and I forgot to do it. The environmental movement has been satisfied with incremental change and cheering for instance, the Trudeau Liberals, because they think, oh gosh, when we get to an election, it'll be so bad if it's Poilievre and the Conservatives. Therefore, we ought to cheer for the lesser of two evils. If we don't really engage people in a real way in a recognition of polycrisis, which includes Israel's war in Gaza, which includes what the hell is happening around the world with, I saw in the chat something going by about nuclear war. Yeah, I grew up in the shadow of the mushroom cloud. My mom was a housewife activist against nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere. I grew up warning other kids not to eat the snow because it contains strontium-90. I did not think that we were going to be rolling backwards towards a threat of nuclear war. If we don't link these things, if we're not prepared to be radical about them, we just kind of allow people to somehow give up. Despair is as big a threat to the kind of movement we need as is apathy. And if people believe that there are other people who, like them, understand the nature of the crisis, we better be a lot more radical. I'm 70 now, and I'm more radical than I've ever been in my life. I'm really fed up with myself that I only got arrested once. And I only got arrested for standing in front of the Kinder Morgan gates. I didn't do anything useful, like, for instance, figuring out how to put sugar in the gas tanks of all the vehicles I saw. I don't understand why we accept that our kids are going to live in what Thomas Homer Dixon calls a Mad Max sort of post-apocalyptic world of we might be able to find a book somewhere that describes how nice the planet used to be when I was born in 1954. I don't accept that. We've got barely enough time to save ourselves, but we're too distracted by our addictions, whether it's to shopping or to just trying to make ends meet. I mean, I don't want to be pejorative about it. People are struggling. I know it's really hard to figure out how you can afford groceries for lots of families. I get that, but we're in a battle for survival. And if we think that we can allow the corporate elites of the world and the parties that think this is all fine to run everything, we miss our chance to save ourselves. And we do have a chance to save ourselves, which is why the word radical has to be embraced, because it means going to the root. Going to the root of change means identifying the capitalist exploitative project, the colonial project of Canada puts us off on the wrong foot from the get-go. We have to go back to the root and say, we're animals on a planet on Turtle Island, and if we can give land back to Indigenous peoples, that would be a good start, and eliminate the doctrine of discovery and rethink what our project is so that it embraces everything at once, which includes, facing the military industrial complex and deciding it's not good enough to have climate treaties that leave out the military. Anyway, sorry, Bianca, it's too much of a rant, but we better be radical or we're dead.
Yeah, we need more rants. Just a historical thing on this, that after the war, in the first few decades after the war, there was a sense of capitalism having to legitimate itself. And when Maggie Thatcher said there is no alternative, it was a reflection of recognizing that we don't actually have to make concessions to these people. They're not very strong. They're paper tigers. And what that led to was a certain fatalism amongst people. I think Elizabeth called it something else. I don't remember, but a certain fatalism that we can't do anything. That does lead to apathy. But, that's the real loss. And we have to blame the defeat of the left and our own defeats. I just mean some abstract left for why there's a right. We haven't been an alternative to this. They've actually mobilized the anger and the frustrations. So in terms of this question about being radical, we have to recognize that, for one, the system isn't actually that legitimate right now. People are really suspicious about political parties, institutions of all kind, and that creates an opportunity. We just haven't been organized enough to take advantage of it. And the reality is that the right has no answers. You're not going to solve all the problems that people have by keeping immigrants out. I mean, there's just no connection here. And Hitler had answers about we have to expand it, that'll enable us to provide you with jobs. They don't even have those answers, as horrible as they are. The right doesn't have answers. It's playing to people's frustrations and creating outsiders that they can blame. So we actually have to see that there's an opportunity. We've just failed to take advantage of it. People are hungry for something that gives some meaning to their lives and to what will happen to their kids. And I just want to say it's not, when you're trying to start challenging the status quo, it's hard, but it's the only thing we can do. I mean, it's not even a choice. We do it or you die. It's not a choice. And but on the other hand, there are opportunities. I mean, you can talk to all kinds of people who are frustrated and they don't know what to do. They're angry. There were promises they heard from liberals or social democrats that weren't fulfilled because they were too modest. And we have to inspire people with hope, but not lie to them. It's not illusions we want to give them. We don't have to tell them that, well, this is pretty easy. Just elect some good politicians and this will change. We have to be honest about how hard this is. And my experience is that if you're honest with people and they know there's a plan and they think that there are others with them, they can start seeing that they don't need this to see the breakthrough tomorrow. They can join things, and that's how we can build.
Thank you, Sam. Any thoughts, Govind, on this question?
Yeah, I think kind of building on what Sam was talking about, I think when we talk about kind of responses, things like that, that continue to follow that like logic of, just like the market as the solution, whether it's, oh, if we just, change this, then the market can respond properly, and this is the problem, and such responses, they never fail to, or sorry, they always fail to, offer actual meaningful responses. And I think like someone put in the chat earlier is things like a universal basic income, like those kind of things that actually challenge those ways of thinking about individualistic responses, and that's how we can solve things, are going to continue to fail. But building wider movements that are organizing and mobilizing people around things that actually challenge that way of thinking through different policies that might have a meaningful impact, like a universal basic income, I think that's necessary in any response that can actually tackle the poly crisis that we've been talking about.
I'd like to add a couple of things, but maybe Elizabeth wants to go first.
Well, I don't have to go first, Sam. I'm loving hearing you. This is really exciting to be able to actually talk, and I want to reinforce what you say. I think being honest with people is a precondition to anything, right? What we have is too many people who want to pander to what they think Canadians want to hear or Americans want to hear. I have much more confidence that grown-up people who live on this world and understand that they want a healthy, functioning democracy can handle the truth, especially when they realize that there are solutions that are, and this is the thing about poly crisis, any solution has to work at all levels. So I kind of visualize poly crisis like a Rubik's cube that's losing all form and function. So everything's in disequilibrium across multiple spheres and multiple levels, geopolitical tensions, and when you're looking at the climate crisis and inequities, that kind of disequilibrium means that things can change fast and all at once. And the collective will for change and the recognition that in this societal project of making sure that we shut down the military-industrial complex, get rid of fascists, get rid of hate-filled disinformation and propaganda that seeks to make people hate each other instead of caring for each other. I actually believe people faced with polycrisis will say, yeah, I like over there that option that says we could be more radical and reject that. I like what you said, Sam, when in the days when capitalism had to present itself with a friendly face because it was in a war against what it thought was USSR and Cold War and communism. As soon as the Berlin Wall collapsed and the USSR collapsed, capitalism stripped off the old friendly face and became neoliberalism. And then you had deregulation, privatization, and a war on justice that was summed up in Maggie Thatcher's "There is no alternative." We have to give Canadians and Americans and Brits and everyone all around the world in industrialized economies and industrialized democracies an understanding that the alternative is survival, and the alternative is compassionate, caring society and community that does not prioritize transnational corporate profits over our own survival. It's insane that we believe that we should allow transnational corporations to have hundreds of billions of dollars of profits every quarter while we wring our hands over teeny weeny tiny little carbon taxes that have no impact on the cost of living. But people get lied to, and when they're being fed nothing but garbage anyway, lies can look good. Over to you, Sam.
Yeah, I just want to give an example of a concrete thing that unions might do and that they're not doing. I think that every union should have a committee on the environment. Some of them do, but an active one. And its point would be to confront their members with analysis, challenge them, debate them. Don't write them off if they disagree with you, but really force a discussion. And then also have committees that ask the question of, what if this place was going to close? What would we do? And to actually start thinking about, well, look, we have all these skills and this machinery. Here's what we could do that would really be useful, and kind of prepare yourself for that moment. And when that moment comes, don't accept closing the place. Say this actually belongs not to that corporation. It belongs to the people, basically, not even just to the workers. It belongs to the people. And we have to find a plan, because sometimes if you take over a plant, you take over a bumper plant, it seems like all you can do with it is sell bumpers to the car companies. But if you had engineers looking at this and studying what you could do, then you could start thinking about seriously, look, we think that this place is closing. They're just running it down. Can you send in some people to look at this and to think about another plan and get workers actively thinking about this? And that would be a start. Once workers kind of get it into their head that there are these big things happening, they're going to pay attention to whether this is going to close. They're going to pay attention to what else do we need. They're going to pay attention to the environment. I was involved when General Motors was first closed their plant in Oshawa after the workers had made concessions to keep it open, and GM said, big deal. That was just a piece of paper. We tried to talk about converting the facility. At that time, it was COVID. So we started off with trying to get them to make masks that we desperately needed. And one of the problems we ran into is workers saying that's a great idea, but you're just a bunch of, there's just a few of you. You're a couple dozen people. What can you do? And one of the lessons from that is we have to create structures that people can feel like if they work through them, it will matter. Otherwise, it's just kind of an abstract argument about what could be different. So I'm trying to stress how important the organizational question is in all of this. And of course, once you start talking about that, you're talking about a collective response.
So there are quite a few questions in the chat, although we don't have that much time. So I'm going to try and push on and get to a couple more of them. Charles and Karen want to know panelists' views and ideas about the role of public investments. It would be good to hear the panelists' views about the role of public investments in addressing the ecological crisis. I think I'll start with you, Gobind.
Yeah, I think they have like a major role, or they should have a major role in addressing the crisis. Now, what does that like specifically mean? I think it means not investing through like subsidies to private corporations. I think it should probably be things more like that are publicly owned. So one example, if just going back to EVs as a specific example, if you wanted to try to create more demand for that, building more publicly owned like charging stations, if that's again what we want to think about. But the probably better response is more public transit and investing in building that, creating that, what companies are building that. Is that something that can be done publicly? How can we do this? I think that's a major way that we can encourage that response to happen through public spending.
Thank you. Sam?
Okay, since you're running out of time, I just wondered whether you want to take a few questions, but I'm happy to
Sure,
respond.
I'll take a few after I hear from you and Elizabeth. I'll put a few
Okay.
together.
I guess, yeah, obviously you want institutions whose goal is the public interest, not making profits. But I think what we have to recognize is that, in a capitalist society, public investment can also be used in negative ways. So we can't just say because it's public, it's necessarily good. There's a struggle over to say, well, what should it go for? You could have public investment that says we're going to build more ports so we can import and export more, or you can have public investment that says that we want to improve public housing, for example, or community spaces. So I think when we talk about public investment, we definitely have to talk about its actual purpose, which is basically the question of making sure it's democratic. Because, if it's just the state doing it, it's not necessarily good. It could follow the same logic. You can have them seeing their whole role in life is to strengthen the private sector. So I think that's one of the things we have to think about when we raise that as a question. But, just as a general term, in a general sense, if you really looked at investment in both Canada and the States, the biggest gap is the lack of public investment to improve our infrastructure. That's completely being sacrificed, and that's relevant to all the questions we're asking. It's a safety question. It's an environmental question. It's about water supplies. It's about bridges and roads. It's all those things. So there's an enormous amount to do in public investment. I mean, if you looked at any municipality, they will have files full of things that they'd love to do if they had the funding for it. So the other thing I'd raise is whether we also have to think about a public bank of some kind that allocates money. The catch is, if it's a bank that has to raise money on the money market, then it's always thinking about how it gets enough of a return. And that becomes a problem. So what you'd have to do is set up a bank and actually fund it. You might take a portion of all pension funds or insurance funds or of all banks, a special tax on them. So they get money, not that they have to bid for. And then the question they have to answer is, what's actually the good things to do with this? And then you have to think about, how you have the kinds of boards and democratic structure to do that and what its mandate actually is. So I think it's really important, but it's nice to talk about it because it raises all the complexities that we have to think about, and that's great.
Thank you, Sam. Elizabeth, unless you'd like to comment on that, I think I'm going to.
If I can go really quickly.
Yes, please do.
I want to mention the name of one of the leaders globally thinking about polycrisis, and that's the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley. She talks a lot about polycrisis, and I think it needs to be said that we need to think way bigger than we're thinking as a country, as a community of nations. Post-war, we reimagined the global financial systems in the Bretton Woods institutions. We have polycrisis that we can't rethink or rewrite the laws of atmospheric chemistry or atmospheric physics. We can rewrite rules like right now, if you fly from New York to Heathrow, that the cost to the global environment of the greenhouse gases from that flight doesn't go anywhere and isn't taxed. Mia Mottley talks about, and the same thing for global shipping. Put a carbon tax on global shipping, put a carbon tax on international aviation, put that money in a public fund that is there for the least developed countries, for the poorest of the poor, to alleviate poverty, to help them be prepared for and avoid climate crisis events where they can. In the Canadian context, very quickly, we have a Canadian pension plan, and then there's private pension plans for individual sectors. But my God, the Canadian pension plan, our CPP, is run by something called the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board, which by law must only invest in those things with the greatest return on investment, which means we invest in armaments, we invest in fossil fuels, we do not invest in Canada. Why don't we rewrite that law that says the Canadian pension plan investment dollars must go for public infrastructure investments that improve the well-being of Canadians, public, affordable ground transportation everywhere. One of the recommendations to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, well, you don't want to have vulnerable people hitchhiking. We have the lousiest ground transportation system once you get outside a city that I've ever been to in any country I've ever visited. Well, I live here. I don't visit a lot of other countries. But there's things we can do that are operational, tactical, immediate, and should be done immediately to unleash public sector investment, and not on $34 billion, which I like to put in its real terms, $34,000 million of public money to build the Kinder Morgan pipeline that most people in BC didn't want and that First Nations are still in court trying to stop, but it's finished. These are basic things. Where do public dollars go? We need public infrastructure investment, and it needs to advance the well-being of our society, and all the things Sam said about municipalities we desperately need basic investment in all manner of public housing, waterworks, you name it. So I'm going to shut up. I'm sorry about how long my rants are going, because I know we're almost out of time.
No, we need more rants. Sam said it well. We need more rants. The revolution needs rants. So all three of the following questions pertain actually to the comments that you just made, Elizabeth, around the well-being of people living in Canada, investments in transportation, international solidarity, addressing the most vulnerable. So Margaret wants to know, and you can see these in the chat as well. Margaret wants to know, I'm wondering how panelists see the perceived imperative of economic growth, planetary health overshoot, and the existing energy use disparities between wealthy countries and the global south. Another person says, minerals used for EV production currently come from horrific child slavery and environmental assault in Congo. What can Canadians do to ensure that our pursuit of a just transition isn't just transferring our climate destruction to already exploited people and lands? And then Murray asks, why are we not pushing electric public transit instead of EVs for the reason of returning space for people in our cities like Toronto, and stopping the building of any more highways, which are now killing endangered species? So I'm actually going to turn to whoever would like to speak first. Sam.
I don't, again, Elizabeth, if you want to jump in, go ahead. But
well, I mean, I agree with like the whole slew of questions there. Why are we not talking about public investment? Because we're still captured by the idea of, I mean, the electric car debate is very different if you're talking about how do we deliver the cheapest possible car to the greatest number of people that gets off fossil fuels. It's going to be the day that China sells cheap electric cars out of Walmarts. But as long as our vision of an electric car and transportation that's electric is a Tesla, we're going in the direction of, again, an elite that can afford an electric car instead of democratizing transit. Electric, fast, high-speed trains, our rail system is a mess. I recently mooted the idea at a press conference in Winnipeg that the CN and CP Rail, which are now privatized, you know, the biggest shareholder in Canadian National, I'm sure this crowd will probably know, but it's Bill Gates. And CPR's full name is the Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Railway. Maybe it's time to take back those rails that we built so that the Teamsters don't get locked out by those bastards, and we actually are able to deliver and have passenger rail work and not have to rent the rails and the tracks from a privatized set of rail companies that can't serve the grain farmers in the prairies because they can't get tracks and cars and Teamsters hired on time to deliver grain on time. We are supposedly a modern industrialized country. We operate an antique railway that doesn't get anyone from A to B on time, anytime, at all, and it doesn't get the goods delivered either. And why did we build a system with public investment 100 years ago to turn it over to be privatized? I do think we need to be a lot more radical about what we demand.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Gobind.
Yeah.
Oh,
Go
Sam.
ahead,
Sam
Govind.
looks like he
No,
wants
no,
to-
go ahead, Govind, and I'll jump in.
Gobind and then Sam.
Okay. Yeah, I think just like I was just saying, I think it's a very good question of why are we not considering more about public transit instead of like private EVs? I think part of that does have to do with the very like individualized way we like think about things and approach the topic. I think before we were talking about, you know, what response really does the left have, but while the right is like very much mobilizing and like actually like people are organizing out there, and it's along those like individualized ways of thinking, which I think touches upon the fact that, you know, a lot of things people were like told or promised to that, you know, didn't really get delivered. And so I think like the important thing is how do we try to like start advocating for like policies that are actually like obtainable, that people can organize around, that is one of those options. And I think, you know, maybe something like public transit, like more expanding public transit in like an electric meaningful way is something that can start challenging those ways of thinking. And I think that's probably something that's quite important to do.
Thank you, Gobind. Sam.
Yeah, well, I think the point that you raised at the end, Govind, is you emphasize that there's a cultural change that we're trying to talk about. And you know, that's very important. We're trying to change the common sense. And a lot of the common sense is actually structured. In other words, if public transit is lousy, then you depend on your car because it's logical. And you know, and the history of public transit was actually that the auto and rubber companies worked very hard to make sure that the transit system and the railroads were not very good. And that's what led to people feeling like, you know, plus they've invested in public investment was roads. So I think a few things here that are coming up. One is the question of the global south, and whether we're saying that we have to sacrifice for them to have a larger share of the scarce environment. And I think that's something we have to think about. I mean, I think that I don't think this is a question, you know, we have to think about in terms of the global south, for example, if it wasn't for the fact that global companies who compete control these technologies, we would be giving these technologies that they need to them, both for the environment and, you know, for public transit or whatever. So, you know, in a different kind of power structure, there's transfers to the global south that we could do without hurting ourselves. You know, once we have the technology, let them use it. I think we do have to think about how fast we want to grow in terms of personal individual consumption, but being sensitive to the poverty questions here, which means we need radical equality, but also globally. I think we have to be sensitive to that if we're going to do that, that does impose some limits on it. I think the cultural thing is so important because I think we also have to think about different forms of consumption. And that doesn't necessarily mean a decrease in our standard of living. It means a change in how we measure what's valuable. You know, if we had a lot more community spaces, much more active, you know, places where people could come and learn music because they're interested and they don't have space for it at home. Although, you know, community spaces, public transit, you know, just developing other parts of our lives that we don't have time to nurture. I think that's something that we have to think about. So you know, I don't want to underestimate it, but I'm confident that we are actually so rich. And if we deal with the questions of equality and thinking differently about what's of value and recognizing that what we want for ourselves has to be universal. If you're a socialist, it's not about socialism is for me and my friends. You know, it's a universal project. But in saying that, I want to emphasize that you cannot get to socialism without organizing and changing things at home. The main struggle is at home, but always with this international sensibility about what our goals are. And I think that's critical.
Thank you. So I'm just going to put forward the final questions, which are all about the way forward. So Jerry says, do you think unions have an interest in developing independent relations with China to gain access to advanced EV technology? Another commentator says, does the union movement in this country accept Sam's example that unions are one of the existing institutions that could start mobilizing workers to recognize the need to radicalize given the urgency. Gerardo says, why does Canada need to follow the US like a vassal state? Does it? And then Glyn asks, how do we avoid this catastrophe? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on one or all of these. And I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
Well, I can't answer questions on what the union movement should do. I'll be respectful to this Sam's area. I think the trade union movement has been a consistent force for good in the world and in Canada. But there are times when we get diverted by the idea, and certainly, well, I just said I wasn't going to get into it because it's not, but I really want to leave that with Sam. There are things we can do, and the starting point has to be that we continue a conversation and build and organize. And we have to, and Govind is right. The right is organizing. How are they organizing? They're rage farming. They're picking issues that are divisive, like attacking trans youth and weaponizing a bizarre, when the first time Blaine Higgs from Premier of New Brunswick started talking about coming out against SOGI programs, I thought, well, he was always an idiot. So that must just be a one-off from one idiot premier. But you see how it spread. And it's now become a key portal to organizing for all, for hard right vote change, because it's now transformed into something called parental rights. There's some very strange things afoot. Strange movements to organize to take over local school boards, to ban certain books. It's not like we can afford to sit back and pretend we're spectators to Canadian communities and our democracy disintegrating all around us. We see it, we notice it. If we're activists, we have to reach out with both hands and pull everybody we know into the same movement, lock arms, and demand change. We're in a BC election right now. I hate to be partisan, but if everybody who's watching and lives in BC, if you vote for the Green candidate, it sends a pretty strong message that climate matters to you. And it makes a big shift in the way the Canadian corporate media decides there is no alternative. The way they said to every voter in Ontario, Doug Ford's going to win a big majority. They had a drumbeat on it. Steady, steady, steady. What happened? They had the lowest voter turnout ever in Ontario. 24% of eligible voters turned up. Where was the organizing to say, Doug Ford only gets a majority if you stay home? That's what they want. It's called voter suppression. So this drumbeat that a Pierre Poilievre majority government is inevitable. That's what people want. Don't you hear the drumbeat? I don't find anybody who, well, I mean, you know, my circle of friends, I'm not likely to have a lot of friends who think Pierre Poilievre should be prime minister. But what the literal hell? We have, and it's not a partisan thing. They don't have to, or you don't want to support the Greens, go out and organize for some other party. But we have 5 parties in Parliament. We have to make sure we have 5 or 6. Keep the power away from the people you can't trust. It's a J.R.R. Tolkien moment. Don't let any of the evil guys get the ring.
Thank you, Elizabeth. J.R.R. Tolkien moment. Govind.
Yeah, I guess I can respond a bit to the one about unions and an interest in independent relations with China. I don't particularly think so, although I will also say, in terms of like the technology and production that happens in Canada, there's already a fair like capacity to produce these like EVs. There are like a lot of parts producers here that I think it's more so an issue of there is no, like they would require a lot of support for a public company like that. For example, I think around the time the Oshawa GM plant closed, there was a campaign to start producing mail trucks there, but it didn't really get kind of off the ground there. And there was a whole report that kind of laid out why this was a somewhat viable plan. And I think this goes back to what Sam was saying earlier with the like unions need to start more engaging like their membership to start thinking about these environmental issues and debating them on it and getting themselves like involved with these to start thinking that, you know, showing that these are, oh, actually, can we consider different options are available instead of the status quo of what we've been used to. So to summarize, I don't think they have an interest in that, but I think it's also not the question we need to be thinking about. It needs to be thinking about what we can do now. On our own.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, when I'm critical of unions, it's because I'm speaking in the context of their potentials and how essential they are to anything we do. Because unions are, they're structures with organization, with funds. They can disrupt the economy and have power that way. This is a site where people meet each other every day, so it's a great site for organizing. So unions are actually crucial. I object to people romanticizing unions because just cheerleading them ends up with them no pressure on them to change. And what we need to recognize is that unions have really been hammered over the last half century, and they're going to have to change. And there's reasons they don't change. Sometimes you don't want to stick out your neck because uh, you don't think that there's other people there with you. Sometimes you actually don't mobilize the members because you're nervous about creating the leaders. Sometimes you don't want to take on a fight because you don't know if you're going to win, and then it'll look bad if you lose. There's all kinds of stuff going on. But I think what unions have to recognize is they can't win the battles. They might get a higher wage sometimes, sometimes not, but they can't actually win the battles alone. So they have to think in class terms and in terms of relationship to the movements. They have to actually think about capitalism. You don't even talk about it. You have to know who your enemy is and how they operate. And so unions have to, just practical things. I'm not saying unions should be ideological and talk about class and capitalism. I'm saying it's practical, just for your everyday life. I think that unions have to be militant, because if you're not militant, then you're obviously taken for granted and nobody's organized or cares. But you have to recognize the limits of militancy, and that requires you to be very creative about, how you go forward. So, I was giving the example of we should have committees there investigating what happens if they close this place. What ideas would we have so we're ready, instead of saying, well, there's nothing we can do. That's too bad. And that's the only way you're going to have a fight. And I think that can happen everywhere. There's no day that there isn't a closure in almost every large community and most of small communities. So they can do that. Unions can set up committees that include family members, teenagers, and maybe a spouse or not, uh, who would look at what's happening in the school system and think about running for local office, or challenging what's happening in the school system about how they're how they're teaching both labor history and racist issues. I just think that it's a real institution, and it would have more life. It would have a lot more people who are active. Because unions will usually say, well, we've got enough things to do. Well, you get more people active and you can achieve more. And again, this is a necessity. I think that unions, if they don't change, are going to keep slipping. Even if they have their members, if you don't have, Canada has, its unionization rate is 3 times that of the United States. And you'd be hard pressed to argue that the labor movement in Canada is 3 times as dynamic or even more dynamic. It's the kind of unions you have. And the spread of unionization. I mean, the labor movement should be saying, we need to organize Amazon, not one union organize it. We all have to get together and say, Amazon's the second largest company in the world. It's so central to everything. Why aren't we organizing it? You go to the GTA where most of our Amazon, most of the Amazon facilities are, and, in Brampton, 3/4 of the workers are Punjabi. You have to actually make connections to the Punjabi community and find their leaders and work with them. So there is a lot that we can do. We have to stop asking whether we can do it, but that we have to do it, and we have to figure out how to do it, and that we're smart enough to figure out if we really want to do it. And it's not easy because it's been so long since we've seen those kinds of vibrant movements. So it's hard to believe, but that's what we have to recreate. That sense of we can do it. It takes collectivity, it takes organization, it takes sticking out our necks. It actually starts, takes challenging all these common sense that's out there. And I think people are waiting for it. I think the right is there primarily because we haven't offered an alternative. I mean, of course, they have all kinds of advantages in terms of their resources and being financed by key people, but we have to recognize a big part of the problem is ourselves.
Whew, okay, so I think that's an excellent note on which to end our discussion. We are so grateful for your analysis, Elizabeth, Sam, Gobind. You all have so much clarity about where we are, where we need to go, the poly crisis we're in, the solutions that need to be integrated, the justice that's needed for all. I loved hearing that the right has no answers. The answer is to organize, build, mobilize, and that these opportunities are here. And I think it's really clear that people are hungry, even desperate for this. And I think, as both Sam and Elizabeth said, it's time. It's do or die. The status quo is done. And this is a time for honesty. I loved hearing that. This is a time for honesty. It is a time for class consciousness. So thanks again. This was such a practical discussion. And I think this conversation is an example of the fact that we do have the answers. And what is lacking is the political will. And hopefully unions can, in fact, must be a part of this. So again, it's time. So to all of you at home, just want to say, please do continue to stay informed and engage, speak out, act. People can handle the truth, as Elizabeth May said. And please do share this webinar. So much is at stake. Let's all continue to keep working for peace, international solidarity, and to address the climate emergency. And it looks like Elizabeth would like to say something before we leave.
No, I want a virtual group hug. I don't know how to do it. If anybody on this webinar emails the organizers, send them my personal email address. This is a good conversation. I haven't had such a good conversation in a really long time. And Sam, if I don't see you again and not on Zoom, it'll just kill me. So thank you guys so much, and we'll talk again.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks for organizing
Here's my
this.
virtual hug.
Great.
I hope that you can feel it.
Yeah.
It's been a great event. Thanks to the audience for your great questions. Thanks to Jessica McVicker in the background and John Price for your work behind the scenes, CFPI, the University of Victoria Center for Global Studies, the team at CCF. Thanks again to our brilliant panelists and discussant, Elizabeth, Sam, and Gobind. Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.